Good afternoon.
Good
Hi,
afternoon.
Fatima. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you. How are you?
I am great. So today we have Fatima Kelleher with us, and I'm going to ask Fatima to introduce herself along her who she is, who you are personally, who you are professionally, and what your philosophical or political ideology is.
Okay, so who I am personally. So I'm Fatimah Kelleher, as Crystal has mentioned. I am a Nigerian and as well as an Irish British dual national. And all of those things have played some kind of role in sort of getting me to my, I suppose, way of thinking right now. Um, Lots of different things I love and I'm interested in: spoken word, poetry, speculative novels, science fiction, fantasy, more specifically, as well as martial arts movies. That's my personal. My political, I am an African feminist, a socialist, and one who has been, I suppose, engaged in particular in looking at the way in which gender, class, and race intersects in various spaces. So race more specifically in the global north, within the diasporan context, but within the Nigerian context, looking at what that means in terms of regional, sub-regional specificities, as well as ethnicities and religion. Um, and then in terms of my professional, I am a women's rights professional, specifically working at the moment in the economic sphere. So I work on women's economic rights and justice, but I have worked also extensively in the education section, again, looking at gender.
Great. Thank you so much. That's a whole breadth of life and experience professionally and not professionally. I had no idea you were interested in martial arts movies. Um, that's really cool, though. So Fatima is part of what we call the NAWI AFRIFEM Macroeconomics Collective that is working to deconstruct and reconstruct economic policy narratives, and then thus influence economic policy both on the region in Africa and globally, but doing so from a Pan-African feminist lens. Now, as we've been building the collective and working, and even before we joined the, created and working and been working on the collective, one of the hugest things that we constantly notice is women's knowledge and women's thought leadership, especially African women's knowledge and thought leadership, and especially on economic issues. So I want us to have a little conversation about why there's such an issue. Is it completely lacking? Is it there but just not found? Is it found in very disparate places? Or do we need to do a lot more to make it accessible and there?
So yeah, I mean, okay, so that's a big question with lots of little sub questions. So I will start, I think, by first of all addressing the issue that we're trying to essentially challenge as NAWI, right? Which is that we are living in an age where the dominant economic ideology is extremely narrow in frame. So we know that's neoliberal capitalism, and there really isn't any space for pluralist positions, and there hasn't been for the last 30 or 40 years, particularly when it comes to African development. And so within that, you will find that a whole sort of, swathe of different types of people who have got views on the economy, as well as actual pluralist economists, are not, sort of being given either the space to actually do the research and create the knowledge, or the knowledge that they're creating is essentially being sidelined, marginalized, etc. And then when you get into that more deeply, from an African positioning and from a women's positioning, what we see is, I think the word that we were using before we came on was the duality of what is it, of invisibility. That's it, duality of invisibility. And so we know that, there are far fewer women acknowledged within, sort of economics as a profession. And, even in terms of being able to have opinions on the economy, women are marginalized from that. It's a heavily masculinized profession. It's viewed as a science, although there are quite a few economists who say absolutely is not a science. And we know, globally, actually, that sciences are always presumed to be better for boys, better for men, etc., etc. So you have all of that horrible social gendered norm stuff coming through there. But then when you add to the fact that African voices and African intellectualism, African thought, and Black women's voices and Black thought more broadly are always marginalized and mainstreamed as a result of our colonial legacy, as a result of the deep-seated global inequalities that exist, dominated by anti-Blackness and a global hierarchy of positioning where if you are of African descent, you tend to be recognized the least, across the world. African women, therefore, are less likely to be heard, even if they have a position. So what you get is a scenario where on the one hand, you will have African women who are economists producing knowledge, but several things could be happening there. So they could be producing knowledge, but their names are not being recognized. So we know there are a lot of African sisters who are working within a variety of different organizations. Some are non-governmental, some are governmental, some are corporations, and they'll be producing knowledge, but their names may not be actually making it onto those documents and those papers. So fundamentally, they're being invisibilized through that way. But then we also know that African women will not necessarily be the first to be contacted if work needs to be done. And because of the power structure that exists in the creation of knowledge, with the global north still dominating that entire sort of industry and the production of that knowledge, particularly when it comes to development economics, then you get a scenario where African women are not being given the chance to actually engage with the research in the way that they want to. And then if they go ahead and they do it independently, it's about where can they then put it out. So, we know you can apply for periodicals, etc. But, it then comes back again to, the connections you have and a variety of different other things that can end up precluding you from being able to get your work out there. And then, of course, even if it is out there, will it be listened to? Will it come up on the table in decision-making space? So you have these various levels of marginalization and being blocked out. And within all of that, there will be gaps. There will be gaps where African women have yet to write or to speak on or to engage with a particular aspect of the economy. But then that's all part and parcel of everything else that I've mentioned so far in terms of the opportunities that are there. But I think in the first instance, the one thing we do want to recognize is that African women are writing on the economy. They are speaking on the economy, not just as trained economists, but from a variety of different positionings, as activists, as just, the average woman on the street who knows and understands her own micro level reality and can speak on what needs to happen at the macro level because of that lived experience. But they are not being given the space and the chance, and this is part of the prejudice that exists at a gender level and at a racialized level and at a continental level as well.
Mm. So those are many intersections of being locked out. Yeah. There's an anti-pluralist agenda in terms of economic thinking that doesn't give space to different thoughts and narratives. And then the fact that, anything coming from the continent of Africa, there's questions there. And then if you're a woman, an African who's trying to go away from a neoliberal agenda, it's like 3 levels of exclusion, right? And so we have a lot of work ahead of us, but it's interesting because there's a lot of work already there. It's just not in a space that everybody accesses or knows where to access. I mean, just a quick Wikipedia search and all the feminist economists that are listed, out of them, I don't think there's a single African on that list. And I think that's very, very telling in terms of decolonizing both Wikipedia, the internet, but also making space for different voices. And so then, in comes the Nawi Collective, and we've been thinking about how to work around this, right? This is the work, the analysis and the narratives that we contribute to the deconstructing and reconstructing of this analysis, and in many different ways, through written journals and books. But, you know, like you were saying, a woman selling vegetables does know her economic reality and can speak to what needs to be done to make things better for her, because, you know, economic development needs to be people-centered, or so some of us believe, and have actual living, breathing human beings at the center of thinking around what needs to be done for the development of economies that support this. And so what now he's coming up with is what we're calling a knowledge portal. And so let's go through a little bit about what this knowledge portal is and what it hopes to, what gap does it hope to plug in?
So the knowledge portal really has come about, you know, in response to just the very simple act of trying to put, you know, my own policy pieces together, my own pieces of research together, and struggling to be able to find pieces through this, you know, vehicle that we now all use, which is the internet, in order to find our data sources, right? And the challenge that you find when you use various keywords and you put it into a search engine, I'm not going to promote a particular one right now, but I think we know the one that is the dominant one, right? You put it in, and what will come up more often than not are, you know, reports and pieces by the large UN bodies, right? Or large international NGOs. Now, sometimes those don't have even an author on it. So even if an African woman had actually been involved in that, she may have been eventually pushed down the authorship list. And so you are then stuck essentially trying to find, you know, this work, because you want, if you're writing a piece, particularly if you're writing a piece from an African feminist positioning, you want to actually be able to find African feminists, or at the very least, just African women, even if they're not, you know, self-identifying African feminists, but African women who have written and had positions on this stuff. And so, you know, essentially it was a response to them saying, okay, there is stuff out there, because you find it over a period of years, but you don't want the next person who decides to go into this space to have to spend, you know, 5 or 6 years to come up with a list of, you know, individuals and pieces to cite. So this portal is essentially just that. It's a window, it's a door, you know, it's an entry point into the internet primarily to actually find all of the African women who have written or spoken about, or, you know, delivered speeches or been in panel events on the economy, so you can source that directly. It essentially does all of the hard work to a certain extent for you, and it collates it within sectors. But more than anything else, you know, it provides that very clear idea of what is available, what isn't, and it removes very critically the excuse that you cannot find, you know, African women who have written on this, or, you know, I cannot find an African woman to turn up for my panel to write, you know, to speak on this specific issue. I cannot, you know, cite an African woman in this section, because I understand why that might have been difficult, because I've had that challenge myself, as I think we all have. But this portal will now remove that. And so it is essentially, you know, this sort of enormous kind of entry into the matrix that is the internet, as a way of, as you said, decolonizing it, because it is a highly colonized space. It is a space, despite being free, and we are grateful to its founder for having made it free at the point of access. The way in which it now operates with, you know, paid advertising, SEO expertise, you know, search engine optimization expertise, which only the biggest organizations are able to bring in, means that fundamentally it is still deeply unequal in the way it presents its data. And so we are trying to overcome that in this particular space. And there are many other spaces of African feminist thought that this also needs to be done. But, you know, this is our area. So we're starting with this first and foremost.
So something that I've been really excited about is the breadth of knowledge that the portal will give a window or a door into. So there will be sources from journals to books to articles to blogs, but at the same time opening it up and saying, you know, knowledge doesn't have to be written in a journal article for it to be knowledge. And so we're also trying to collate speeches, both in written form, but also recordings of speeches, podcasts, this, influx of webinars that we've all had to go through the last, almost year now. But that's reported knowledge that I think is really important, and hopefully we can capture it in a way that people looking for that content can find, or news interviews that have recordings of African women giving their views and their thoughts and their narratives on macroeconomic policy, which I think is really important to pluralize, if that's a word, the space of knowledge on the internet and beyond as well. So let's talk a little bit about gaps and challenges as the portal was being created. And I know there must be many, from how do you document or provide access to a book that's only in print form and isn't, on the internet, or journals that are, hidden behind paywalls. What happens then, and how does the portal begin to work around that, or just what are the challenges that we have seen coming up with the portal?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I think we are going to encounter quite a few of these. And in fact, the work is about each of these challenges coming up and us finding a way to overcome it, because that is the process of actually decolonizing and opening up and making everything accessible. So the first point that you make, I think, is a very important one, and it's, for those pieces that are not actually digitalized on the internet, and there's a whole variety of those. Some will be quite historical pieces, and so that's why, for obvious reasons, they may not be on the internet. They may have been written before the internet went live in the 90s, or they were written in the 90s before everybody was essentially, uploading everything, and so they got lost in the stream there. And one of my very first love, I have to say, is history. So for me, that historical aspect is critical as well. So we're essentially also playing an archiving role here. And, the very simple reason for that is because we cannot assume that anything that was written, more than 15 or 20 years ago is no longer relevant. We understand that, academic practice in particular requires that you keep your citations as recent as possible. But actually, there can be a flaw in that, especially when you see the way in which modes of thought are being sort of commandeered towards one area, because then you could find everybody is pretty much saying the same thing anyway over the last 5 to 6 years. And what you really need is that person who said something very different 25 years ago, but that's the thing that will give you the answer. Also, from a feminist positioning, we have to understand where everything that we have now has come from. So all of our sisters who came before us and were writing on this, thinking on this in different forms, they may not even have been using feminism, as the term at the time. These are the shoulders on which we stand on. So it's our duty to actually do that. But then, of course, there are also more recent pieces that are not in print. There are some books that were published around the time of the financial crisis. There was one piece that looked at harvesting feminist knowledge for policy making and decision making. And this was an anthology, and within it, there was a fantastic piece by the Senegalese economist Yassine Fall that looked at water and food commodification and the impacts at this, at the national level, and what this actually meant from a gendered perspective. Now that book is not digitalized, but I was able to come across it through a preliminary search of looking specifically for the issue of commodification and looking for an African feminist who had written on this. And then I had to then buy the book as a secondhand book, through various channels. What we want to be able to do is, first of all, let people know that the book does still exist, so it doesn't just get, consigned to oblivion. This was only written in 2011, so it's only 10 years old actually, and now we're in a second economic shock, we're in a second economic crisis, and actually there's a lot to be learned from what was written in that anthology from all of the writers. But what we actually need to do is find a way to make those pieces accessible now as well. Now, we haven't quite cracked that yet because we're in the early stages, but what that could start to look like, where we perhaps have a digitalization aspect of this project, will also be really exciting, because I think we will find more and more African women perhaps in those sorts of spaces.
And so I guess it also speaks to the politics of referencing and how political that is in and of itself. And this is something, the more, we've been working on this portal, the more important it comes up as an issue. It's very easy to write a paper and reference the easiest places that you can, which is usually global north. In as much as they are progressive narratives, surely we have our own, and we have African women who have been writing on this for years and years and continue to do so eloquently, in such articulate ways, and in ways that is deeply rooted in the nuance and reality of our lived realities, with our colonial baggage, with our current neo-colonial and neoliberal oppressive systems that have been put on us. And so I think it's an ode to the politics and the struggle of referencing, and whose knowledge do we continue to push through, and do we continue to reference, and whose knowledge continues to grow, I think. And so let's look a little bit forward thinking. I know we've spoken a little bit about the future and what we hope and dream as we move on into the next phase after we've launched this. But what are we hoping to do with the portal? What gaps are we looking to plug in? What plans and dreams and aspirations do we have in the future? Are we taking over Wikipedia maybe? The internet as a whole, but just a little bit about future thinking and maybe even dreaming and reimagining as much as we can.
Yeah. So I think, we over the course of the last, year and a bit, I think since we've been, this has been germinating, and in the last 6 months, this has actually been built. We've had a lot of different ideas for what we need to do. I think, in the first instance, what we want to do is actually, alongside the database that we've created so far, and this is an endless project, right? This is actually an eternal project, if we can look at it from that perspective. We also want to raise the profile of as many of the women who are writing these, especially those women who have also had a strong role in the feminist movement on the continent, and who have had an engagement with the economy in some way. So raising those profiles and challenging the current Wikipedia narrative of there being no African economists within the Wikipedia page on women economists, and yes, taking over Wikipedia and making sure that those who wish have a Wikipedia presence as well, alongside their non-African sisters, so that that presence is more clearly felt, is, I think, one of our first steps, right? Because it's also about the people, not just the written form. I think the second aspect, really, in terms of maybe bringing about a change to the way in which knowledge is received and cited in the politics that you spoke about, is by the very nature of the pieces that we're putting up there, the fact that we're not only putting up written pieces, and we are putting up verbal pieces, audio pieces, video pieces. If we can bring about some kind of a shift in the way this knowledge is acknowledged and received, I think we would have made a massive stride there. And I think it's very important to actually look at what the intersectional politics of how, of who has the time to write for periodicals and who doesn't. So we know, if you're an academic, you're more likely to have time to write for periodicals, and not all academics actually have that kind of time. So let's also look at that. And there are a lot of different things that play out in that. For a lot of our feminist activist sisters, some of them are academics, and some of them, quite frankly, are not. But that does not mean that they do not have, the level of knowledge and expertise needed to provide the kind of thought leadership that we're looking for. And they're doing so, but in different sorts of spaces. So they're appearing on panel events, they're doing a variety of talks, they're engaging in news broadcasts. Now, the way in which you are able to cite this will probably have a whole heap of political ramifications, and there will be critiques and stuff, but we're here for that. Let's push that envelope. Let's have that discussion. Let's get the criticism back. Because I know that we've got African sisters who would leave many an academic economist, like eating their dust, quite frankly, forgive the colloquialism. But they just don't have the time to write right now, a lot of the time, because they're busy doing activist work, as well as, earning a living and a variety of different other things. These are the intersectional realities that women are facing on the continent. So, let's put that out there, and let's have a tense conversation if needs be about what that means, and let's get it sorted. Let's push it. But there are so many different things that we want to do as well. So I think one of the things I'm most excited about is the idea that a young African feminist economist right now, at university perhaps, doing her master's, let's say, thinking about going on to do her PhD, or maybe not, has just completed a fantastic dissertation, which may or may not make it onto the university website. She wants to get it out there in some form. Maybe she can't get it into a periodical. We can provide a space for that. We can provide a link to that if she was to upload it herself onto another platform, and we can get her into the community that engages around that discussion. And through that, we might find that we're plugging a lot of gaps in certain areas that seem kind of sparse at the moment. So, financialization is still an area I think that we need a far more expertise on. We know there are several key prominent African feminists writing in this, but I'm really excited, given how, sort of current it is, at the number of young African women who may be looking at this in a variety of different institutions at the moment, who could see this portal as a space where their work will not just be lost into oblivion. It's also a space for us to find the connectivity between the micro and the macro. So even though we are focusing on macro level discussion and conceptualization and thought, we are not completely locking out micro level research at all. There's a fantastic piece on the domestic care sector in Lagos, which is at the micro level. It was a dissertation piece of research for a PhD by Zara Nesbitt Ahmed, and that has huge lessons for macro level policy considerations on unpaid care and domestic work that our policymakers need to be understanding, particularly those who are currently in charge of this in Lagos State, but Nigeria more broadly, and Africa as a continent. So these connections is another thing that we can do in terms of making that micro to macro and macro to micro level engagement more clear and fluid, and less like completely separate entities of economic thought.
So you've also just answered the last question that I had for you, which was, what is your most exciting part of this? Like, what are you most excited about? What gives you the tingles most? But you've answered it in some way. If you'd like to give us anything else that gives you the real tingles. For me, I can say, if I can find some academic piece that has a reference to an African feminist person on Twitter, I think we made it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I also, just in terms of my excitement, thinking about how our lives are whittled down to case studies for academic pieces and thought processes in the North specifically. But I think it's high time that we analyze the situation and contribute to a narrative from our own voice, from our own narrative. And I think that makes such a huge difference in terms of nuance and direction, and especially nuance and direction that influences policy. Us here living, breathing the problem, it's not a piece of work that, and I keep saying this, that we can close our laptops to and go on, working at the end of the day. Even for our African brothers and sisters in the diaspora, there's always somebody you have to send money to, or some fundraiser that needs to be contributed to. So it's an everyday part of our lives. And I think that lived reality has such a huge contribution to narrative thought and thought leadership as well. But I'll close with just asking your very last point of tingle, or something that you're most excited about, and then we'll let you know. We'll also just announce when the website will be up with a portal, so that we can share this labor of love, really, that we've been working on for so long. And also the labor of love of all the African feminists that have been putting so much thought down and articulating such complex theories and narratives. And finally, they can be found all in one place. So.
Wow. Okay. Yes, there's so much to be excited about. I think if I had to choose just one, it would probably be the community that this could enhance. So we already have a community, there's no doubt about that. But the way in which, this particular portal, through the work that it's doing in terms of actually profiling everybody who's writing, in terms of actually, identifying the gaps, highlighting where the strongest areas are, looking very specifically at what our engagement could then be with all of this knowledge and actual systems change in the future. I'm really excited by how that's going to bring women from across multiple fields into one place to discuss the economy. So not just those who are trained economists, not just those who are social scientists like ourselves, and not just those, you know, who have even, you know, sort of an activist background, but anyone who has got a voice and an opinion on the economy and believes that this is something that African women, you know, need to be heard about and also need to engage with. So I'm really excited by that. And there'll be lots of different offshoot projects. You know, I think the idea of archiving is one, the idea of digitalizing is another, but I think every day we come up with these different ideas for the little offshoot projects that could contribute to this. So yeah, there's a lot to be done. And we've only just scratched the surface. It's going to get harder from here, I feel, but you know, but we're here for it.
Great. Thank you so much, Fatimah, for joining us this afternoon. We're really looking forward to the launch of the portal. I think it goes up on the 9th of March, the day after International Women's Day. So join us there, and thank you again, and have a lovely, lovely afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.